Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Breaking news tonight in relation to a likely migrant boat, illegal asylum boat hitting Australia. I'll get you all those details. Let's have a look at what's coming up tonight on the program. Despite all the evidence pointing to Chris Bowen's emissions targets falling well short, the minister seems to think the best approach is to double down in net zero madness, announcing today a taxpayer-backed explosion in green energy funding. A Queensland mum in her early 50s has died after waiting more than an hour and a half for an ambulance. It's left her child an orphan, and Queenslanders asking why their state is yet again in the headlines over services that all Australians should be able to expect as a basic right in this country. There's a link here too to the Premier. I'll explain that a little later on. Plus in that news, it's come in late this afternoon. It would appear Australia has got a return of people smuggling boats, with 12 foreign nationals found wandering in the Kimberley to our north. More on that shortly. And we'll get into the details too of those 860 visas approved for Palestinians with the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, James Patterson. Given we've got no consular presence in Gaza and security paperwork, well, it's not mandatory. That's right, not mandatory. Well, you can even apply online, actually. You can have someone else apply for you online. I don't think we can believe a word of the PM's claims today that he's got the security checks under control.
These are temporary visas. There are the same security checks that are in place for people, for Australians, that have been in place, this regime, for a long period of time.
All right, I'm going to get into those visas in a moment, but first, the energy madness that's set to send us broke and back to the dark ages literally continues. Today, the Federal Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, announced a new government program to increase the bankrolling by taxpayers of new renewable energy projects from 6 gigawatts to 32 gigawatts, or about roughly half the total generation capacity in the national energy market. Chris Bowen, the brains trust who came up with the tax policies to kill off investment properties and superannuation, who was also the bloke who holds the dubious record under Julia Gillard for the most illegal boats on his watch as Immigration Minister. Well, he's the bloke now in charge of our energy security. Naturally, Bowen's announcement today is completely uncosted. That's right, it's uncosted because the government insists that all these new investments are economic. Economic, despite the fact they're currently not happening because no private investor is prepared to take the economic risk. And very conveniently, the government says that any of the potential costs, they can't be revealed because it says that might distort the market. Now, I've got to ask, what market? This is an energy system that's been bastardised by government green interventions for years. A system, I might add, that worked perfectly well prior to the advent of our emissions obsession, but a system that's now on the verge of breaking down, even though 24/7 power is the absolute foundation of all modern life. And equally naturally, Labor has excluded gas-fired power from this new scheme, even though it's the only reliable way to firm, intermittent, inherently unreliable wind and solar. And that's because we use gas peakers that can then power up and down as needed almost instantaneously. Now, listening to Bowen today, there's only one certainty here. And that's the further we go down the renewable power route, the more expensive power will become due to the simple fact that we need power all the time, not just when nature wants to give it to us. And this is the fact to which Minister Bowen and all the renewable zealots are willfully blind. Here's the Minister on Radio National today, blathering on about this all costing very little.
And what happens to bills? Will this investment have an impact on how much we pay for our power?
Certainly no negative impact, PK, because the Commonwealth is underwriting it. So that's the case. But it is the case, though, that over time, the more renewables you have in the system, the more downward pressure that puts on bills, because renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy.
government's underwriting it, as if the government isn't your money. I mean, get this into your head, Minister. It's only cheap when the wind blows and the sun shines. We need power all the time. That's why the more renewables we have, the more expensive our power gets. Even the business groups, which for so long have played along with climate catastrophism and bent their knee at the altar of so-called energy transition, well, they're now deeply worried that government policy is sending us over a cliff. The Minerals Council Chief, Tanya Constable, is now expressing deep scepticism about whether this transition is even possible, let alone happening. Is calling on governments to, quote, reconsider the urgency to remove coal generation. Now, let's leave the last word, at least now, to Jenny George, former ACTU President and Labor MP, who had a powerful letter published in yesterday's Australian newspaper. Her verdict on Labor's energy policy is, and I quote, "It's all politics and virtue signalling driving the agenda. Rhetoric," she said, "continues to trump reality." I tell you what, if only Jenny George was still in the Parliament. And look, we still don't know exactly how many foreign criminals have been released from immigration detention, or how many are subject to reporting requirements and monitoring via ankle bracelets. Under those new laws that have just passed the Parliament, but are already being challenged by activists in the High Court, some of the detail is missing from the ministers, because it's been a week of buck passing and contradicting. Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill and her offsider, Immigration Minister Andrew Giles, went to ground today. It was left to a spokesman to confirm that there are now 111 foreign criminals released into the Australian community. But the spokesman couldn't say how many of these were actually subject to monitoring or wearing ankle bracelets, just that the implementation, quote, is continuing. In other words, the government is still playing catch-up. And this same government, the same government that didn't anticipate losing the High Court case, that had no plan B in place, that first denied legislation was even possible, let alone necessary, and that then needed the opposition's help to make that legislation tough enough to be credible. Well, this is the same government, the same ministers, the same Department of Home Affairs that's now in charge of trying to ensure we don't get potential terrorists coming to Australia amongst the 800 plus Palestinians out of Gaza that Labor has just given visas to. Yesterday, Foreign Minister Penny Wong was adamant that proper security checks, she said, had or would be done.
People are subjected to appropriate security checks. I would again say this. People who obtain visas to Australia are subject to appropriate security checks. People who obtain Australian visas are subject to appropriate security checks.
But as the former Prime Minister Tony Abbott said here last night, how can you do security checks on people living in a war zone where there are no Australian officials to do them?
As far as I'm aware, there are no Australian officials whatsoever in Gaza. None. So I just wonder how this could possibly be correct.
And according to information right now on the Department of Immigration's official website, you can apply for a visa out of Gaza or any of the occupied Palestinian territories online. In fact, you don't even have to do it yourself. As the website says, close family members can apply on your behalf. What's more concerning to me, as I went through the detail needed to apply for one of these visas to Australia, is that no great security information or clearances are required. Indeed, it says in black and white on the website that you may, just may be asked to provide information like a police certificate or sign a stat dec, but none of that's mandatory. Even if it was, though, do you really think the Palestinian Authority is going to bother telling Australia that applicant X or applicant Y is one of the terrorist supporters? No, I don't think you do either. And these visas are being issued to people coming from a place where some 75% have support for Hamas and also support what happened to Jews on October 7. Today, the Prime Minister was asked, how do you ensure these people are aligned to Australian values and are not anti-Semitic? Anthony Albanese's response was, these are the same security checks that are in place for people, for Australians that have been in this place under this regime for a long period of time. Now, these would be the same checks, PM, that didn't stop people coming to Australia, hate preachers and others who revelled in the Hamas slaughter, standing out as they did protesting on the steps of the Opera House.
When the stones and the trees will speak and say, "Oh Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." This is the time! Allah! What are we waiting for? Allah!
If they get on with those sort of checks, doesn't fill you with much confidence, does it? All right, let's go to Canberra now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Joel Philp.
Good evening. Bruce Lehrmann has denied calling Brittany Higgins good-looking to colleagues at a pub in Canberra. In a tense cross-examination in his defamation trial against Lisa Wilkinson and Network 10. It was suggested to the court Mr Lehrmann had snatched Miss Higgins' phone off her to stop her ordering an Uber to leave the Canberra pub where the pair met on the evening of the alleged sexual assault. Mr Lehrmann responded that did not happen. He told the court he lied to security to get into Parliament House that night because he was concerned he would be told by security to leave. Following allegations of sexual assault airing on Network 10's The Project, Mr Lehrmann told the court he checked into a mental health facility in Sydney. Lisa Wilkinson, Brittany Higgins and Fiona Brown, the former Chief of Staff to the Minister Miss Higgins and Mr Lehrmann worked for, are all expected to give evidence in the 4-week-long judge-only trial. The federal government insists hundreds of Palestinians granted temporary Australian visas have been properly vetted. 860 visas have been granted to Palestinians with connections to Australia, including spouses and children of Australian citizens. But the opposition fears the government hasn't had enough time to ensure none of those pose a safety threat to Australia.
860 visas in a 6-week period in a conflict zone in which the Australian government has no presence on the ground is a very large number of visas in a very short period of time, and I am looking for reassurance from the government that no corners have been cut in granting of those visas.
Those comments prompted a furious reaction from Industry Minister Ed Husic.
We are trying to help people that are in a dire space, and I don't understand why the Coalition would have a problem with us, like the rest of the international community, chipping in to get people out of harm's way.
The Prime Minister and Foreign Minister insist long-standing visa procedures have been followed and are thorough enough to protect Australians from threats coming from the conflict zone.
These are temporary visas. There are the same security checks that are in place for people, for Australians that have been in place, this regime, for a long period of time.
Just as not everybody from Afghanistan is linked with the Taliban, not everybody who is Palestinian is a member of a terrorist organisation.
Thousands of students have ditched school to join rallies in support of Palestine across the country. In Melbourne, hundreds of protesters blocked a busy intersection and demanded an end to military aid and support for Israel.
Israel is on stolen land and that's Palestine, not Israel.
It shows that us as school students, we all have a voice.
Everyone should take a stand and try to make a change.
We're high school students and we know the truth. So why doesn't everyone else?
The protests were not supported by both major parties nor the Jewish community.
Goodness me, it just shows how ignorant our curriculum must be, if that's the view of kids. Joining me now for the latest, Herald Sun columnist Patrick Carline and the Director of Law and Policy at the Institute of Public Affairs, John Story. Gents, welcome to the program. I want to start with some economic issues. A renowned macroeconomist, Gerard Minnick, has slammed the Albanese government today for what he says doubling down on a dumb strategy by relying on population growth to grow the economy. He also noted that a chronic lack of investment in our infrastructure relative to this population growth, he says, has been massively detrimental to living standards and will weigh on productivity. Have a listen.
It's all about migration is the big change, and it's got dialed up quite aggressively almost 20 years ago. And the results being that we've had pretty poor economic performance ever since. If you look at the size of the economy per person, it was the worst 15 years in the post-war period. And we're doubling down on it. We've seen population race higher. We've got quite weak investment. And unfortunately, if you repeat the same thing, you get the same results.
Look, I've been saying this for months. The real rot started under Kevin Rudd and it's just continued. But I mean, this is Rudd on steroids now in the Albanese government era. The Economist, though, finally brave enough to speak about this publicly, and polls show more and more Australians agree. John, do you think the PM's ready to listen?
I'm not too sure. We'll have to see. The reality is that there's nowhere to hide now when it comes to interest rates and cost of living pressures. At the beginning, the government did inherit some problems, some inflationary problems, and they've been quick to blame those issues. High spending during COVID, COVID supply chain issues, and also the Ukraine war. Well, it's clear now, even the Reserve Bank is now saying that this is a homegrown problem, and this is just kryptonite to the government. Once people start attributing to the government that their hip pocket problems are their fault, they're in big trouble. And the reality is, yes, they may have inherited some inflationary problems, but all the policy levers you can pull to try to reduce it, they've done the opposite. They've re-regulated the industrial relations market. Their climate change fanaticism is driving up energy costs, and the out-of-control and unplanned immigration is just causing incredible problems in the housing market and pressure for renters. The figures out today from the ABS are that over the next 5 years, we're going to get 1.8 million new migrants coming into Australia. That is the population of South Australia. And unless we build the infrastructure equivalent of South Australia in that time, which we're not doing, the result is we're going to have high inflation.
And spending is key in that, and the government controls spending. Poor old Reserve Bank's got one lever, and I reckon they're going to keep using it, forced to keep using it. Let's go to comments from mining entrepreneur Gina Reinhardt. She says the sector need to get their own workers and advocates into the parliament, get them in there so they can tear up the red tape and the green tape that's jeopardising the industry's ability to keep its current levels of production. I might add also that production that earns the revenues, that pays the taxes that underpin our bottom line. She's even called out the PM for all his overseas trips to promote trade, because she says, back here at home, mate, your local industry is drowning with regulation. Here she is.
The bureaucracy blocks us or hinders us at every opportunity. Projects succeed not because of government, but in spite of it. Isn't common sense refreshing? But that important ingredient, common sense, is missing in governments and most left media.
I mean, yes, she inherited her father's company, Patrick, but she's grown it into this massive enterprise beyond mining, agriculture and more. Government would be smart to listen, wouldn't they?
Well, Gina seems to have this sort of resonance with average people that belies her wealth. She seems to understand what they're talking about, and she not only sort of identifies the problems, she actually finds solutions as well, and she uses terms like common sense. And that really resonates when people don't hear that sort of plain talking from the government, certainly, and a lot of politicians in general. I think she's definitely onto something here. If she's saying there are problems with red tape, everybody sort of needs to listen, because everyone's going to take notice, aren't they? Because she is who she is. And
she's successful at it, and all politicians are successful. We'll get into this announcement by Chris Bowen today, backed again and yet again by the poor old taxpayer on green energy schemes. But the other threat to our revenue source, and I might add, mining contributes more to our tax base than every other corporate tax player in Australia combined. The other real risk is IR legislation that's working its way through the Parliament. The head of the Minerals Council said today that the reforms from Tony Burke will seriously hurt the industry. The head of the small business lobby says it's going to impact them as well. But John, it doesn't look like the government's listening. Help us understand why the bill's so dangerous.
Well, the bill is dangerous because it robs the labour market of flexibility just at the time when we have low unemployment and a worker shortage. It tries to effectively treat all workers as full-time unionised workers, and that has the result of increasing wages in some respects, but also being an impediment to matching employers with workers. And that, at a time of high inflation, is an absolute disaster. It was really good to hear the comments from the Minerals Council today, because the government is adopting a divide and conquer strategy. They're slowly giving concessions to various industries to get their support. And to return to Gina Rinehart, she's called that out and said, no, these laws are bad for the country. Even if some segments might be able to cut a deal, they should be opposed.
Just quickly, Patrick, Qantas, least reliable airline in the country in October. We learned today, though, quite rightly, I think, staff are furious. Alan Joyce looks like he could get another $6 million in terms of long-term bonuses coming to maturity. That's on top of the $21 million he's already set to receive. So if you look at his time at the airline, over 15 years, the bloke's been paid $150 million to basically run an airline into the ground. Where do you get a job like that?
Well, you talk about Qantas workers being furious. I think 98% of Australians are furious. I mean, you're talking about a national icon, as you said, that's now a second-rate airline. And, you know, he's got $150 million over 15 years. It's an awful lot of money. I think most Australians would actually like to see most of that money come back, because he's left the company in reputational tatters at the moment. He's done a poor job. You've got illegal sackings of 1,700 workers. You've got ongoing sort of claims in the courts. I mean, it is a basket case that he has left. I mean, he's not worth $150 million or $20 million, Peter.
You're being generous there, I think, too, even at the end. Patrick and John, thank you. Let's go to those school protests, predominantly in Melbourne, but they occurred in other centres around Australia. Joining me now to discuss this, the President of the Australian Jewish Association, Dr. David Adler. David, just quickly, we'll get into some other really big issues, but on this one today, I played some vision of those children. Sad to see them there, shocking that parents allowed it, but also the level of ignorance, I thought, was alarming. What's been the reaction of the Jewish community today?
Well, Peter, we have a number of concerns. Firstly, as Australians, we want our students actually learning things that they need to learn. As everyone knows, Australian educational standards are going down, and they're not supposed to be trained as political activists. The second point is that obviously we're very concerned that this is anti-Israel indoctrination at school level. And if people haven't seen it, it'd be interesting to test the reaction of some of the Islamic chants that the students were following, not just Allahu Akbar, but also the words that are used to convert people to Islam were repeated by the students in Melbourne. I'm not suggesting that the conversion process was completed, because you have to say it 3 times with intent, but they're actually learning the words to convert to Islam today on the streets of Melbourne. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, I'm looking at the short skirts and the uncovered heads of those women there, those young women, which, as you and I will know, would be allowed in Israel, but not across the border. Can I get a reaction from you from the confirmation today from the Home Affairs Department, backed in, of course, by Penny Wong yesterday? 860 visas have been approved for Palestinians between October 7 and November 20. Both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister talk about security checks. Well, I had a good look at the website. These are subclass 600 visas. There is no mandatory security checks. You apply online. Indeed, someone else can even apply for you. And if paperwork is required, if it's required, it comes via the Palestinian authorities. Now, I'll talk a bit more about this with my next guest after the break, but even if Hamas isn't hiding terrorists potentially in this cohort, you've got to be worried whether their views are in step with mainstream Australia.
Spot on. It would be hard to find a place anywhere on the planet where the ideology, the culture is more anti-Western. Unfortunately, there have been 2 generations now which have been brainwashed with hatred of the West and also anti-Semitism. But apart from the paperwork to which you refer, there are a number of proofs that the promises that have come out of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister are impossible to deliver. This is not moderate risk, this is not high risk. Be clear, this is extreme risk. Now, we know that something like 75% support for the actual terrorism undertaken by Hamas. But here's 2 proofs at how difficult it is. One is none of the nearby Arab Muslim countries are offering refugee programs. Now, maybe they know a little bit more than the bureaucrats in Canberra. And secondly, Israel has issued a number of work permits, some thousands of work permits to people in Gaza to come and work in southern Israel. And Israel does a lot of security screening, as you would expect. And even with the level of security screening done by Israel, come October 7, we find out that hundreds were actually feeding detailed information to Hamas, and many of them joined in the terrorism rampage. So you have to have an assumption that somehow the bureaucrats in Canberra are going to be way more effective than the security apparatus, even in Israel, in screening these people. It beggars belief. You've got to think that maybe 20%, 30%, 50%, who knows, will have views that are totally incompatible with integrating into Australian society and possibly terrorism supporters.
And I have to say, David Adler, I have sat on the other side in government and had some of those serious briefings, and you are 200% right. Dr. David Adler, thank you for your time. I'll get into this after the break, but I want to make the point. When we took people out of Syria and out of Afghanistan to active war zones, it took months and months and months to make those assessments. They're happening now online in a matter of hours. All right, coming up after the break, we'll speak to Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Patterson on why those claims about security checks aren't adequate, don't stack up. Plus, Energy Minister Chris Bowen doubling down on his net zero agenda. More taxpayer handouts today. Welcome back, but first to the concerning decision by the Albanese government to issue 860 visas for Palestinians between October 7 and November 20. Now, I've had a good look at the subclass 600 visa, the one Foreign Minister Penny Wong said was being used to grant the 860 Palestinians entrance to Australia. And as far as I can tell, applicants apply for the visa online. Things like ID checks and police reports are not mandatory. In fact, the website says only that they may be required. Worse still, if they are sought, they would be supplied by the Palestinian Authority, I presume in Ramallah, so questionable in terms of veracity, to say the least. The website also says, as I outlined a little earlier in the show, that individuals don't even need to put in the application themselves. Someone else can do it for them. So not onerous at all, is it? And with that sort of lax paperwork required, alarm bells start ringing for me, given recent polls that show 75% support by Palestinian Arabs in Gaza for the Hamas terror attack on October 7 that murdered over 1,200 innocent Israeli civilians. Joining me now to discuss this, Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, Senator James Patterson. Well, I have to say, all in all, it's pretty worrying. Penny Wong assured us that all the appropriate checks are being done, But if it is this visa class, which she says it is, you have a look online, James, and there's a concern.
Peter, you've set it out perfectly well there. There's a whole reason that we should be really concerned about this. There's a whole lot of red flags that we should be worried about this. The Australian government has no presence on the ground in Gaza, obviously. There is no functioning state or government in Gaza. To the extent it is, it's run by a terrorist organisation. Even just verifying the identity of these people will be difficult given the context, let alone doing adequate checks on their security and their associations. I am really worried that corners have been cut here, that these visas have been issued without appropriate scrutiny, and that it will be too late if we discover down the track that mistakes have been made.
I do know when we had the issue on the steps of the Sydney Opera House, I mean, there were calls immediately that if these people were on visas, were not Australian citizens, they should be removed from this country. Of course, we didn't see any evidence that that happened. And we've had a number of recent polls, including the one I just quoted there, 75% support, not for Hamas, but support for what Hamas did on the 7th of October.
That's right, Peter. And even if every single one of these people is a completely innocent civilian, genuinely applied, we have to be really careful about the attitudes that we'd be welcoming into this country and the consequences for social cohesion in this country. I don't want to see any more Sydney Opera Houses. But of course, it wouldn't be beyond Hamas to try to sneak someone into this cohort. We know they are trying to get their operatives out of Gaza, out of harm's way, out of the way of the IDF. Why wouldn't they try and take advantage of Australia or other countries that are good-natured and likely to welcome humanitarian applicants? I mean, the Prime Minister said today, in a way to try and reassure us, don't worry, these are just temporary visas. They might only be here for a few months. But you can bet once they're here, they're going to try and stay here, and they'd be well within their rights to make an application for a humanitarian visa to stay here permanently.
The Foreign Minister yesterday, when pushed on this, basically then pivoted and pointed to the number of Israelis that have come here to Australia. But of course, Israel's a functional democratic state. There are checks and balances. We have a large, well-staffed embassy in that country. That's the difference.
That's spot on, Peter. It's a rule of law, liberal democracy with a functional state, with an established Australian presence on the ground. Very easy to identify people. Great criminal records to check whether someone's committed a crime or other issues. Very easy to verify. It couldn't be any more different from Gaza. And I think that was pretty underhanded of Penny Wong to try and make that false equivalence there. These are two very different circumstances and should be treated as completely separate.
I am not surprised. I am dismayed, though, to hear reports today in The Australian that late this afternoon it has been reported that a boat looks like it's arrived on Australia's shore, an illegal boat. We still don't know a whole lot of detail, but what can you tell us?
Well, this is entirely predictable, as you say, Peter. When Labor gets in, this movie is the same every time. They soften the successful border protection policies of the coalition, they water them down, the boats start again and human tragedy follows. And it appears in this case that a group of men have been identified off the northwest coast of Western Australia in a very remote area who were not supposed to be there, who may have been dropped there by a boat, and the boat appears to have since disappeared. And their identities are still trying to be established. There are some that may be missing that police are looking for right now, and details will emerge, I suspect, in the following days that will give us more rich picture about what happened. But where is the government? Where is the Minister for Home Affairs? Where is Claire O'Neill? Why hasn't she stood up and been honest with the public about what it is that we know and what we don't know? I mean, this government is completely lacking in transparency and competence when it comes to border protection.
Well, we know where the Minister is today. She's gone to ground. So has the Immigration Minister. We had, I guess, calamity yesterday in the media appearances, unable to confirm how many of the detainees, now over 100 released into the community, how many of those are wearing ankle bracelets, how many are monitored. She seemed, Claire O'Neill, to be at odds with comments made by the WA Police Commissioner. And there's a real sense, yes, they were caught napping. Yes, they relied on you and Peter Dutton and others to bolster that legislation through the Parliament. But now that they have the legislation, they don't seem to be even implementing it as safely as they should.
It keeps getting worse and worse and worse on this issue. I mean, yesterday, the Minister for Home Affairs, who is responsible for her department, who is responsible for Australian Border Force, said she could not answer, did not know whether or not electronic monitoring, which is supposed to be mandatory, had actually been enforced, and if so, how many people. And she tried to handball to Immigration Minister Giles, who has been in witness protection this week for obvious reasons, and not take responsibility. She's the senior minister in the portfolio. Border protection is her policy responsibility. Community safety falls on her. If she doesn't know what or doesn't care to ask, that says something very worrying about this government's attitude to protecting the community from what are serious offenders. And as you say, the numbers keep creeping up every day. Only a few weeks ago, it was only going to be 92. Even before that, it was only going to be 1. And now we're into the hundreds. I mean, how many people does Labor plan to release into the community, and what conditions are going to be imposed on them?
Senator Patterson, thank you for your time. I tell you what, if I listen to my viewers, they want you in the job. You're the only one at the moment who gives as much confidence. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Peter.
He's dogged, isn't he? Coming up, we'll speak to the Queensland opposition leader about the tragic death of a Queensland mum that's got so many in the Sunshine State so angry. Plus, why our British heritage that's underpinned Australia's success is now being openly discussed and supported by some unusual suspects. Coming up, thousands of Australians have accused the ABC of bias and inflaming tensions when it comes to their coverage of the conflict in Gaza. But first, our failing energy grid that's on the brink of collapse this summer, according to the Australian Energy Market Operator. Today, Energy Minister Chris Bowen announced that you, the taxpayer, would underwrite a 5-fold increase in the government's so-called taxpayer-backed renewable program across the country. Joining me now for the latest, gas and energy market analyst Saul Kavonik. Well, I'll get you to do a couple of things if I can, Saul. Take us through the detail of this announcement and what it means for real people in terms of their power bill, but for all of us, I guess, in terms of grid stability. But let's not forget, this is a government that said by 2030 we'd have 82% renewables. How are we tracking on that target?
Well, fundamentally, what this is about is we're seeing after the government has made a mess of our energy market, they're now resorting to taxpayer money to bail us out of this mess. And we're now officially well down the road of taxpayers subsidising energy users. What we're seeing here is an admission by the government that they're very worried about blackouts. And they're trying to fix it, but they're trying to fix it without the best, most efficient solution, which is gas, because they need to pander to the Greens. And so they're resorting to more expensive and less effective solutions with this capital investment scheme here. Now, it is a big deal because it's another major market intervention and change by the government. What we're going to see is rolling auctions every 6 months of these capacity schemes. It's not as bad as the renewable energy target was, but it still has trade-offs. And the biggest trade-off here is going to be taxpayers picking up the bill. Well, no details being provided here. The reason why they're not disclosing the pricing and so on that they've guaranteed here is not very good. So we have every reason to be concerned this is not competitive. Gas would have been a much cheaper option. But there's other trade-offs here which are really important for our grid stability and our power prices at home. And that is when the government goes down this route, it also, as an unintended consequence, is going to deter investment from capacity investors who are looking to make investments without subsidies from government and now are having to face artificial competitive pressure from government subsidised capacity. And what this does is it's going to see further drying up of private sector investment without subsidies. And it leads to a vicious cycle where the government's going to have to intervene more, subsidise more, and taxpayers pick up more and more of the bill.
You're absolutely right, and I'll point out that the modelling they took to the election, that's been found on the issue of electric cars, on the issue of these renewable targets to be completely out of kilter with reality. We heard today with this announcement that nothing has been costed. They would not talk about cost. They say they don't want that out there in the marketplace, although you, the taxpayer, are paying for it. It feels to me, Saul, if you look at the results on their electric car sales, 27%, way down from the 89% by 2030 that they promised, and all the calamities you've just explained there well in relation to today's announcement. This feels like desperation.
Well, it certainly looks like that from, I think, energy market participants, where, again, it's just another major policy being announced in response to previous failures just over the last 12 months. you're right about the penetration of electric vehicles is slower. Look, it is actually possible to get to that very high penetration. We've seen it in some of the Nordic countries, but again, with very high subsidies, and that hasn't been costed yet. And all that we do is when we start electrifying, for example, our gas at home and into electric vehicles on the roads, it puts more of a burden on our energy grid. And coming back to that 82% renewable energy target, this capacity investment scheme announced today is also an admission that we're nowhere near getting to that. And in fairness, I think what they've announced today might help us get a little bit of the way there, but we're still going to fall well short of getting anywhere near 82%. That is widely held view across the entire industry. And again, so what we're seeing is another knee-jerk market intervention, another going bigger by the government as we spiral into more and more interventions to fix problems getting towards targets set by the government, which were unrealistic and impossible to achieve anyway.
All right, Saul Kavonik, thank you for joining us from London. I know it's a stretch, but I think it's really important to get your take on this today. Thank you for your time. I say to people at home, every time you see Chris Bowen, remember, worst ever record on boats. And he's the bloke who wrote the tax policies that cost Bill Shorten that, election win that he couldn't lose. Let's go to Queensland now. Emergency health systems there again under fire. A 51-year-old woman, a mum, died after waiting more than an hour and a half for an ambulance. She called with chest pain that never came. Joining me now to discuss this, Queensland Opposition Leader David Crisafulli. David, I don't know whether it's because I'm about that age. I'm 52. And I live in a rich country like Australia. I expect if I call an ambulance, 15, 20 minutes, it will arrive. An hour and a half, it didn't. The victim's sister spoke to the media last night. Have a listen.
If they had have shown up, if they had have had the resources, instead of focusing on what they can do for Olympic Games, put some more money into our hospital system and our health system, maybe. I mean, it's too late for my family. It's too late.
Yeah, this has really hit home across the country, David. What's the problem? Because in Australia, as I said, we should be able to expect you call an ambulance and an ambulance arrives.
She was a single mum, Peter. It's tragic. It's absolutely tragic. And yet again, the government will say we're going to do a review and we're full of remorse. But there's never accountability and there's never action. And I always use ambulance ramping as the figure that shows how sick the system is. When this government came to power in 2015, ambulance ramping had been reduced under the LNP from 30% to 15%. Today, ambulance ramping is at 43%, the worst in the country. Now, what that means is that when the ambulance turns up at the hospital, they are unable to offload the patient because the hospital system is in crisis. That means that ambulance cannot get back out to help people like this 52-year-old woman. That's the consequence. Today, I stood with a family at Ipswich whose father died waiting for a bed to become available in an ambulance at the end of that ramp. It's got to stop, and the government has to listen to our calls. Queensland Health is in crisis and no amount of reviews or remorse will fix it. Only accountability and action will.
I read this statistic today, David. You're going to tell me whether I'm way off the mark here, but it says that every single one of Queensland's serious youth crime repeat offenders, every single one has drug issues. Is that right?
Well, I can tell you what is beyond doubt, and that is in the last 18 months, the number of repeat hardcore offenders have gone from 10% to 20%. So what's happening at the moment isn't working. And again, you talk about reviews and excuses and remorse. The government is now running around trying to say there are less offenders. Well, here's a news flash. There are more victims. There are more crimes. I don't think I've met a single Queenslander who cares about how many offenders there are. It's about the victim. And the government never talks about the victims. And they are there in record amounts. And the number of hardcore repeat offenders shows that. And Queensland is ground zero. If you live in Queensland, you are 3 times more likely to have your car pinched than if you live in New South Wales. That is ground zero in the youth crime crisis.
Keep shining a light, David Crisafulli. I know that you're indefatigable on these issues. Thank you for your time. as always. Coming up, proposed changes to Australia's gun laws. Listen to these ones. Plus, that UK crackdown on people who abuse the dole. They're talking about stopping the dole. Wish they'd do it here after the break. All right, joining me now for a whole lot of other issues we've still got to cover to make sure you're across everything you need to know. My panel now, Shadow Environment Minister John O'Donoghue, Senator for Tasmania, and former Liberal MP Nicole Flint. Welcome to the show, both of you. Nick, you live in the city and in the bush. I want to get your reaction to revelations that every state and territory except for WA is resisting calls to introduce mandatory mental health checks before gun licences are issued. What do you think?
Well, Peter, unfortunately here in South Australia and in my own home district down in the southeast, we've seen some terrible gun-related tragedies this very week, including a long-serving local police officer who tragically lost his life. So I understand that these suggestions are very well-intentioned, but unfortunately they're completely impractical and unworkable, Peter, and it's right for the states and territories to resist, and WA should come in line. Who would do these checks? What would the parameters be? Our mental health system is already under enormous stress, and you'd be adding another level of responsibility and bureaucracy on mental health professionals. So it's, as I said, it's well-intentioned, but it's completely unworkable and it shouldn't be introduced.
All right, John O'Donoghue, what about this letter over 5,000 Australians have signed? It's an open letter to the ABC alleging that the national broadcaster has misguided public opinion and inflamed public tensions by publishing biased coverage of the Israel-Hamas conflict. What do you think, Jono?
Well, the ABC have got form here. There's multitudes of examples out there of their biased reporting on this and other issues. And on the Israel-Hamas conflict, it predates the bloodthirsty invasion of October 7. The Australian Jewish Association lodged a formal complaint back in August about reporting on matters related to this conflict. So there is a real problem there, and the Minister for Communications, rather than focusing on her Orwellian mis- and disinformation laws, might do well to bring the ABC and its staff into line and start reporting the facts as they're required to under their charter.
Nicole, I covered the protests in Melbourne and all the kids ditching school to stand there and wave the Palestinian flag. That's not surprising given the indoctrination in our school system. I think it's sad, it's shocking. Wish it wasn't happening, but that's where we are. But what worries me is a story in the Daily Telegraph today that says a whole lot of young people get their only source of news and current affairs from things like TikTok. And of course, TikTok and Instagram, if you look at the content, they're serving up a whole lot of unbalanced material, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian. That's what concerns me.
As well it should, Peter. I worry for this next generation of kids coming through our schools and our universities. But Peter, the really bizarre and, annoying thing about this is that you and I were both essentially deplatformed and censored by social media during the Voice debate because of our different views on different subjects relating to the Voice. And yet you can see this information just freely published. So how is it that our social media platforms have such different standards when it comes to discussing and reporting opinions and facts, as you and I both do, versus this sort of terrible anti-Semitism?
Yeah, that's where the government needs to put its attention and not on this misinformation, disinformation stuff. Hey, Jono, the equivalent of the Treasurer in the UK, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, has brought down their budget or a financial statement update. Interestingly, they are really cracking down on the dole. Over there, they're bringing in requirements. You've really got to engage. You've got to take work. You'll lose your benefits if you don't. And they'll lose things like access to medicine, dental care, etc. But they're also saying you've got, I think it's about 18 months to get a job and try hard to get a job. If you don't, they'll stop the dole completely. Now, I reckon this is something we've got to look at here.
I mean, for heaven's sake, we have a worker shortage here in Australia. I mean, in theory, there shouldn't be a single person unemployed because they can't find work. It may not be the job of their dreams, but there is work there. Now, without being flippant about it, I think dignity of work is at the heart of what we as Liberals believe in. And so we should be doing everything we can to get people off welfare and out earning a keep and doing what they can for themselves, their family and their country. That's what it's about. And turning to the Treasury side of things, well, of course, the people that pay for this at the end of the day are Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer, and taxpayer funds are a finite resource, and we have to remember that when we see these billions of dollars going out the door. So I'm all for reforms like this. You'd remember in the early days of the Abbott government how hard it was to get the Senate to agree to sensible reforms, but I think we've got to revisit that and have a look at how we can do it here in Australia.
Hear, hear, Senator Dunningham. Let's get on to that one. Nicole Flint, great to have your company as well. Both of you, we'll see you next week. All right, that's it for me. Tomorrow night at 6, I'm not here. Back on Monday, though. Andrew Bolt is up next.